I'm going to begin by giving some preliminary notes on the general shape of this project into which tonight's talk fits. It's an investigation of the history of the devil as a theological, political symbol, primarily in the Christian tradition, although today I'm going to be discussing the background in the Jewish tradition primarily. And I envision this having two broad parts. First, a study of the historical origin of the devil and the way that he became a fixture in Christianity. Although there's a devil-like figure in Islam and in Judaism, somehow Christianity got really fixated on it in a unique way. Secondly, once I've kind of given an account of how the devil arrived at a recognizable state, I want to give a kind of biography of the devil from within the theological system, ranging from his fall before the beginning of history to his contemporary nefarious activities, and ending in his future as both guard and inmate in hell. So the first part will focus on the way theological symbols grew out of and responded to political problems. I will argue that the devil is actually originally a political symbol, and he remains so even when that association becomes less apparent. This is the political-theological connection. The second part will focus on the way that the devil becomes a tool for thinking about how freedom works within the Christian theological tradition. First of all, the fall of the devil becomes a kind of laboratory for how does free will work, how can a creature defy the will of the Creator without it being God's fault. Second, the devil's contemporary allies. How and why do human beings come to associate themselves with the devil rather than with God, especially in a setting in which everybody is ostensibly a Christian and knows that it's a bad deal to go with the devil over God. And finally, the devil's role in hell. How does God respond to human rebellion, and how can the devil be both the punisher and the punished at the same time? And my ultimate goal is to use these theological reflections to think about enduring problems in the modern world. It's a philosophical, not primarily a historical project. We all know in a general way that the modern world inherits concepts and patterns of thought from Christianity. And in specific, I think that the devil is a particularly potent inheritance from Christianity that modern people tend not to take very seriously and really examine what's going on with it. Politics and freedom come together in the symbol of the devil, and they also come together in modern theories of politics, where human freedom, whether in the form of the market or in terms of popular sovereignty, human freedom is the source of legitimacy. And hence it becomes understandable why the devil exerts such fascination in early modernity, such as the tendency to read Milton's Satan as a hero, the importance of Goethe's Faust in the development of modern philosophy, etc., etc. There's a lot of influence. The devil seems to be the most potent symbol that outlives kind of the decline of Christianity and secular modernity. So this is still a work in progress, and I plan to finish it by the end of this year. I'm saying this publicly, so you all will hold me to it. And the current talk comes from the first part, and I'm going to trace the origin of the idea of the devil in the Hebrew Bible or Old Testament literature. And my basic thesis is that the devil does not originate because a certain story happens to have a character that has the devil in it, and then people like to develop that idea. That the devil arises as a potent and convincing and urgent symbol because of profoundly catastrophic historical events. So, okay. According to Tertullian, a 2nd century Christian thinker, any fool can see that there's a God. As he writes in his text, De Spectaculis, on the shows, quote, nobody denies what nobody is ignorant of, that God is the maker of the universe, and that it is good, and that it is humanity's by free gift of its maker. But that is not the whole story. For Tertullian, we have more to learn about God from his explicit self-revelation. First, he makes explicit demands of human beings. Quote, "But having no acquaintance with the highest, knowing him only by natural revelation and not as friends, people cannot but be in ignorance alike of what he enjoins and what he forbids in regard to the administration of the world." And I think this point is fair enough. If we look at, there are many forms of monotheism in the ancient world in which God does not place any demands on human beings. For instance, Aristotle's unmoved mover, probably the most vivid example, doesn't even know or care that we exist. He just sits there being attractive and cool, and we all want to be like him. So secondly, and seemingly more importantly, the kind of value add of historical revelation is that we learn that God has an enemy. Quote, "They must be ignorant too of the hostile power which works against him, and perverts to wrong uses the things his hand has formed. For you cannot know either the will or the adversary of a God you do not know." So, just to review, the first 2 points that we learn from historical revelation, according to Tertullian, a Christian thinker, are not about God, not about Jesus, not about the Bible, but God's enemy. Before he has even mentioned Jesus, he mentions God's enemy. And this goes on for some time. He's apparently very worked up about it. He says, "We therefore, who in our knowledge of the Lord have obtained some knowledge also of his foe, who in our discovery of the Creator have at the same time laid hands upon the great corrupter, ought neither to wonder nor to doubt that, as the prowess of the corrupting and God-opposing angel overthrew in the beginning the virtue of man, the work and image of God, the possessor of the world, so he has entirely changed man's nature into his own state of wicked enmity against his Maker. In sum, anyone can see that there is a Creator, but Christians, according to Tertullian, realize that this world has been effectively recreated by Satan. And this is his starting point for investigating whether Christians are allowed to participate in various forms of entertainment in Roman society. And his answer is basically no, absolutely not. Because all of human culture is absolutely saturated with the work of the devil. We may think that Tertullian is miles away from Jesus' message of peace and love, but Jesus also lived in a demon-haunted world. Constant confrontations with demonic forces take place in the Gospels. The demonic forces know him and fear him. Demon possession is apparently at epidemic levels in Galilee and Judea at this time. And John, the Gospel of John, even has Judas Iscariot become possessed personally by the devil himself. A weird kind of honor. The most notable story, however, is the temptation in the wilderness. This happens in 3 out of the 4 Gospels. And Satan seeks submission and loyalty from Jesus at all costs and offers him all the kingdoms of the world if he will only bow down. And this temptation only makes sense as a temptation if the devil really has those kingdoms to offer. Jesus doesn't call him out and say, "No, you can't even give me that." He rejects the offer. I think that we should take this all as literally as Tertullian does. If the world is ruled by demonic forces, that means that those who factually rule the world are demonic, or at least working on their behalf. This is in early Christianity. Centuries of depoliticized readings have obscured this, but if you're looking for it, the political is hiding in plain sight all over the place. Not just the fact that the devil is offering kingdoms, not just the fact that he enlists the Roman Empire to kill Jesus in a way that's explicitly meant for political dissidents, but also things like the man who is possessed by multiple demons, and they say, "Our name is Legion," which is a name for a Roman military division. Or the fact that in the feeding of the 5,000, the way Jesus divides up the crowds is reminiscent to how military divisions would be organized. It's all right there at the surface, but we have been trained not to see it. So I would further suggest that Tertullian is right that simple reflection is not enough to give us this vision of the world. We need some form of revelation. And I'm going to use a secularized concept of revelation as some type of decisively unprecedented historical event that changes everything, that makes us think about everything differently. We need that type of historical event to get us to the point of the devil. Philosophers may be able to come up with the idea of monotheism by reflecting on the eternal nature of things. But the idea of the devil grows out of a deep investment in concrete events of history, and specifically of historical catastrophe. So as I've noted, the idea of the devil and the demonic is already well established by the time Christianity comes around. It had been an important part of Jewish thought for 2 centuries or more by that point. And in some ways, retrospectively, this is surprising, because Satan is just not a big deal in contemporary Judaism. And Satan-like figures barely appear in the Hebrew Bible. We have the mysterious talking serpent in the Garden of Eden, and Job's accuser. But these 2 literary figures, I think, are not enough to explain why it becomes like center of an entire worldview. And these 2 characters, I would argue, actually only appear to be the devil in retrospect, due to developments after much of the Hebrew Bible had already been written. But these developments nevertheless have their roots in the Hebrew Bible, specifically in the Hebrew Bible's approach to the problem of evil. Stated schematically, the problem of evil is the attempt to reconcile 3 propositions. First, God is good. Second, God is all-powerful. Third, evil happens. That third one feels like a non sequitur. If God has good intentions and is able to carry out all of his intentions, only good should result. What went wrong? And interestingly, in all 3 of the major monotheistic traditions, the mainstream of theological reflection does not try to dispense with points number 1 and 2, but attacks precisely the only one that we have direct experience of, which is point number 3. Try to mitigate the idea that it's really evil. In the Hebrew Bible, this is not posed in terms of a philosophical thought experiment, however. It is rooted in the concrete narrative of God's special relationship to the nation of Israel. That relationship is founded on God's loyalty to Abraham and his descendants, as portrayed in the book of Genesis, but it only reaches its definitive form beginning with the Exodus from Egypt. The events of the Exodus clearly endorse the first 2 propositions. First, God is powerful enough to defeat an empire with massive miracles. He is also good, because he's doing all this to vindicate the Israelites' demand for justice and out of sheer loyalty and benevolence. He didn't have to do any of this, it's just he's doing them a favor. The third point, however, is more complicated, because God takes credit for hugely destructive acts. Between the 10 plagues and the departure of the Israelites, Egypt arguably suffers from every major evil that afflicts humanity. Military defeat, looting, disease, natural disaster, even the premature loss of children. But the clear implication of the narrative is that we should not view these events as evil, because the Egyptians are evil oppressors and they deserve to be punished. So they've attacked point number 3, evil happens. No, that wasn't evil. It looks like it's evil, but that's a superficial view. It's not really evil. This theology of retribution holds for all peoples, Egypt as well as the people of Canaan, whom Israel will eventually dispossess. But it is most intense in the case of Israel because God has made an explicit covenant with them. And in the book of Deuteronomy, this is posed in very stark terms. Quote, "See, I am setting before you today a blessing and a curse. The blessing, if you obey the commandments of the Lord your God that I am commanding you today, and the curse, if you do not obey the commandments of the Lord your God, but turn from the way that I am commanding you today, to follow other gods that you have not known." This basic scheme becomes more elaborate in the encounter with historical experience. Most notably, we need to come up with some way to account for the apparent indefinite time lag between acts of injustice and God's punishment. Nevertheless, it's fair to say that this basic scheme of divine retribution provides the framework for what's known as the Deuteronomistic history in the Hebrew Bible. This is the segment of the Hebrew Bible made up of Deuteronomy, Judges, Joshua, 1st, 2nd Samuel, and 1st and 2nd Kings. all of these books contain a uniform theological view for the most part. And it's a very robust scheme, because God is openly claiming responsibility for just the kind of thing that might otherwise challenge his credibility. And meanwhile, there's plenty of unfaithfulness going on to justify the punishment, because historically speaking, the people who were strictly God-only worshipers were always a minority in the kingdoms of Israel. So, but there is one sticking point for the scheme, and it turns out to be the earthly ruler. Because on the one hand, God seems to be the direct ruler of the people of Israel. He secures a territory for them. He gives them their laws. And according to this scheme, he's also enforcing the laws. He does everything that a ruler does. But at the same time, even during the Exodus itself, when God is most palpably present with the people, he relies on an intermediary, most notably Moses. Deuteronomy gives us a vision of a perfectly subordinate ruler who would serve as just kind of a pure functionary, carrying out the necessary day-to-day work that is beneath God's dignity. But that same book ends with the death of Moses, who is being excluded from the promised land for a sin that the tradition cannot really agree on. It's not clear why he's being excluded. So even the most powerful and perfect representative of God somehow doesn't make the cut. By the time we get to 1 Samuel, when the people are clamoring for a king like the other nations, things have become much darker. The final judge, who is a kind of ad hoc ruler that God appoints for emergencies, Samuel, has been confronted and told to appoint a king. And God says to Samuel, "Listen to the voice of the people and all that they say to you. For they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me from being king over them. Just as they have done to me from the day I brought them up out of Egypt to this day, forsaking me and serving other gods, so also they are doing to you. Now then, listen to their voice, only you shall solemnly warn them and show them the ways of the king who shall reign over them." And then the regime that Samuel goes on to describe to the people is basically the polar opposite of the optimistic image of the submissive divine functionary from Deuteronomy. Kind of a long quote. "These will be the ways of the king who will rule over you. He will take your sons and appoint them to his chariots and to be his horsemen and to run before his chariots. He will appoint for himself commanders of thousands and commanders of 50s. He will take your daughters to be perfumers and cooks and bakers. He will take the best of your fields and vineyards and olive orchards and give them to his friends. He will take 1/10 of your grain and of your vineyards and give it to his officers. He will take your male and female slaves and the best of your cattle and donkeys and put them to his work. He will take 1/10 of your flocks, and you shall be his slaves. And in that day you will cry out because of your king, whom you have chosen for yourselves, but the Lord will not answer you in that day." This terminology of crying out is especially poignant because that's how the people of Israel are described when they're in Egypt in bondage, and the Lord hears them that time. But the implication is, you've chosen to go back to Pharaoh. I'm not going to rescue you again. So at this point, after this point, the relationship between Israel's king and its God becomes the decisive point at which the Deuteronomistic solution to the problem of evil is played out. In other words, the problem of evil becomes a problem of political theology. There are ups and downs, there are apparent counterexamples to the scheme, but in the end, the misdeeds of the kings lead to the downfall of the Israelite kingdoms. The land was conquered by the Babylonians, who exiled its political and intellectual elites to the imperial center. And basically, it seemed as though the covenant had been completely fulfilled to the letter. But it was over. In the face of this unthinkable loss, the Hebrew elites could have been forgiven for turning their backs on their defeated God and bowing down in worship to the foreign gods who had so thoroughly demonstrated their superior power. And doubtless a good number of them did. Yet there was a critical mass who responded to the catastrophe with a bold theological risk. In the face of their God's apparent defeat, they claimed that their local God was actually the God of all the earth. Far from being defeated by the pagan empires, the God of Israel had orchestrated their rise. What appeared to be a geopolitical shift with Israel as collateral damage was actually God's plan the whole time to chastise Israel and preserve a faithful remnant who would one day be restored to the promised land. As for God's unwitting pawns, the rulers of this world, they would be suitably punished for their oppression and injustice once they had served their purpose. These kind of ideas have been circulating among the prophets, who were basically a group of theologically charged political commentators, for some time. The concept of the remnant was a crucial development in this, because it did not require divine inspiration to see that Israel would be defeated by the Babylonians. They realized that they were going to need theological tools to deal with this. And this prophetic scheme basically doubles down on the Deuteronomistic solution, because, again, the very kinds of events that might endanger God's credibility become the greatest possible evidence of his control over the situation. But there's a crucial shift in emphasis. Where the Deuteronomistic paradigm tacitly relies on the existence of a substantial segment of Israelites who are disobedient, and as I've noted before, this was probably most of the Israelites most of the time. The prophetic paradigm focuses on the existence of a faithful minority, and this remnant is actually the true bearer of God's promise, who guarantees the continuity of God's special relationship with Israel, even in the very worst of circumstances. Most important from our perspective, however, is the shift in God's relationship with the earthly rulers. At least for the foreseeable future, there was no possibility that there would be a kind of native Israelite king. And hence there's no room for a rival to God's affections. So perhaps paradoxically, the relationship becomes much less tense once the ruler is a pagan enemy of God. This is somebody I can work with. And there's a quote from the prophet Jeremiah that I think is really illustrative of how the prophetic paradigm deals with the earthly rulers. Therefore, thus says the Lord of hosts, because you have not obeyed my words, I am going to send for all the tribes of the north, says the Lord, even for King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon, my servant, and I will bring them against this land and its inhabitants, and against all these nations around. I will utterly destroy them, and make them an object of horror and hissing and an everlasting disgrace. This whole land shall become a ruin and a waste, and these nations shall serve the king of Babylon 70 years. Then after 70 years are completed, I will punish the king of Babylon and that nation for their iniquity, says the Lord, making that land an everlasting waste. I will bring upon that land all the words that I have uttered against it, everything written in this book which Jeremiah prophesied against all the nations. For me, the key portion of that quotation is the king of Babylon, my servant. The king of Babylon has never heard of the God of Israel. He has no awareness that he is God's servant. He is perfectly serving God by doing what he wanted to do anyway for his own reasons. And precisely because there is no relationship involved, no loyalty, this perfect functionary is also perfectly disposable. Once he's served his purpose, he can be dispatched as his just punishment for doing exactly what God wanted him to do. This is a weird approach. And I have to say, to be fair, not all of God's unwitting servants are unceremoniously dispatched. The prophet Isaiah has high praise for Cyrus of Persia, for example, who financed the rebuilding of the temple in Jerusalem as part of a general policy of fostering local religions in order to gain loyalty from them. And if you read the passages about Cyrus, they begin around Isaiah chapter 40. It's disturbing to realize that many of the passages that Christians are most familiar with as like prophecies of Christ, in context, are about Cyrus, a pagan king. And they conclude and they say, we're going to do great things with you, Cyrus. We're going to bring glory to God through Cyrus, even though you do not know me. So even like the best and nicest king doesn't get to know God. And within this political theological scheme, the Jews are encouraged to suspend judgment of the pagan rulers, basically. God will continue to orchestrate events according to his plan. In the meantime, the Jewish community is called upon to be as faithful to the covenant as they can be under their current circumstances and contribute positively to the society in which they are temporarily residing. And I think Jeremiah has an exemplary exhortation here. Thus says the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, to all the exiles whom I have sent into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon. Build houses and live in them, plant gardens and eat what they produce. Take wives and have sons and daughters. Take wives for your son and give your daughters in marriage, that they may bear sons and daughters. Multiply there and do not decrease. But seek the welfare of the city where I have sent you into exile, and pray to the Lord on its behalf. For in its welfare you will find your welfare. Within this framework, the model Jew is somebody like Joseph or Daniel, Esther or Mordecai, somebody who rises to a high government position and yet remains faithful to his Jewish identity. The king, by elevating him to this position, is acknowledging the excellence of the Jewish community, which contributes to the prestige of the community and brings glory to God, just as the fact that God is able to use the king brings glory to God. And I would say that, like its Deuteronomistic predecessor, this scheme is pretty robust. In both models, the community itself is encouraged to see events that might otherwise seem like inexplicable disasters as deserved punishment that cannot be evil, therefore. And in both models, there is a built-in, if tacit, assumption of some degree of unfaithfulness in the community. The main difference, however, is that whereas the outright unfaithfulness of Israel was the issue in the Deuteronomistic paradigm, in the prophetic paradigm, it's a more insidious question of the problem of assimilation. And I think that the famous story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego is a clear indication of this. That's the name that these characters are known by for the most part. That was the Babylonian name that they were given when they entered the civil service, not their original Hebrew names. The book of Daniel reports that they received very thorough training in indoctrination. They learned the language and literature, including pagan mythology, presumably, of the Babylonians. There's a kind of a near miss when they don't want to eat the food of the Babylonians because they risk violating kosher laws. But then the coordinators agree to let them eat a vegetarian diet, which turns out to be healthier for them anyway. Last time I gave this talk, somebody pointed out afterwards that this is, in the scholarly literature, this is viewed as the first clinical trial. So, this near miss with the food, that was relatively simple to remedy. But once this crisis is averted, a more serious one arises when Nebuchadnezzar, remember, my servant, sets himself up as a god, building a massive statue to himself and requiring all citizens to bow down. And in that case, only miraculous intervention saves them from the fiery furnace. The story is a close call on the theological, political level, even more than the narrative level, I think. It is not only the lives of 3 Jewish officials that are endangered by the king's fiery furnace. The entire prophetic paradigm is at stake. Because that paradigm had taught Jews to tolerate mistreatment as punishment indirectly meted out by God. But how can such a schema make sense in this case, where the Jews are being punished precisely for being uncompromisingly faithful to God? This is not how it was supposed to work. From the political direction, the story also seems to endanger the assumption that the foreign king is always God's unwitting servant. First, Nebuchadnezzar is no longer fully unwitting because he has already acknowledged Israel's God in some sense in the preceding story and even pledges to defend God's honor if anybody insults it. In this story, therefore, he seems to be emerging as an almost conscious rival to God. The way the book of Daniel solves this, though, is that Nebuchadnezzar just seems to have amnesia. Every new incident, it's like he forgets about God. Like every story culminates with him acknowledging God, and then the next day he's already forgot about it. Okay, So the book of Daniel, in addition to these, the famous stories like Daniel in the lion's den, etc., the second half includes some enigmatic visions. And in these visions, we see repeated evidence that God has in mind a very specific sequence of imperial powers, which are variously symbolized by metals of declining quality or bizarrely hybridized animals. Secondly, an additional layer of management has appeared between God and the earthly rulers in the form of figures that we would call angels. Most notably, the concluding visions make much of the figure of the Archangel Michael, who serves as a kind of spiritual representative of Israel, fighting on their behalf against rival spiritual powers. The most decisive change, however, is that the stakes of God's interventions in worldly politics are vastly higher. Instead of simply orchestrating events to chastise Israel and get them back to the promised land, God is leading all of world history towards a dramatic final confrontation that will culminate in the establishment of a completely new world. A brief passage from the end of Daniel's vision encapsulates this shift. There shall be a time of anguish, such as has never occurred since nations first came into existence. But at that time your people shall be delivered, everyone who is found written in the book. Many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt. Those who are wise shall shine like the brightness of the sky, and those who lead many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever. It's as though the restoration of Israel as a nation is no longer enough. Now the dead must be raised. This is actually the first, chronologically, the first reference to the resurrection of the dead in the Hebrew Scriptures. So I think that Daniel does not simply document the breakdown of the prophetic paradigm, but it starts to point towards its successor, which is the apocalyptic paradigm. This paradigm produces a kind of spiritual overlay for interpreting political events, using surrealistic symbolism to lend mystery and profundity to a story that's basically a tedious succession of, like, this guy conquered this guy conquered this. The rhetorical strategy of the book of Daniel is common in the apocalyptic literature. Basically, it projects its vision onto a legendary figure from Israel's past, in this case Daniel, who then retrospectively predicts events up to the author's time, and beyond that into the final days that are to come. So the decisive moment in Daniel's narrative here comes when an earthly ruler sets himself up as a conscious rival to God. He's outraged by political setbacks, and quote, he shall be enraged and take action against the Holy Covenant. He shall turn back and pay heed to those who forsake the Holy Covenant. Forces sent by him shall occupy and profane the temple and fortress. They shall abolish the regular burnt offering and set up the abomination that makes desolate. The king shall act as he pleases. He shall exalt himself and consider himself greater than any god, and shall speak horrendous things against the God of gods. In the final campaign, however, quote, he shall come to his end with no one to help him, defeated by the Archangel Michael. These events, as described, except for the part with the Archangel Michael, they all happened. This is a historical figure who the book of Daniel has in mind. And it's not Obama, it's not Dick Cheney. It's a king named Antiochus Epiphanes, who was the ruler of one of the smaller empires that emerged after the death of Alexander the Great. The book of Daniel was likely written or compiled during his reign, because his career can be neatly reconciled with the vision's predictions up until one final campaign. And we even have evidence that he really was planning to do that campaign, but it just didn't happen. A more literal presentation of the story of Antiochus' reign and the Jews' reaction to it is found in the book of Maccabees, named for the family of warrior priests who defeated the foreign rulers and created the last autonomous Jewish state before modern times. And these books are probably best known today for including the events surrounding Hanukkah. Those of us with a Protestant upbringing have been unjustly deprived of these books from the Bible because Martin Luther decided they didn't belong. Catholics are more fortunate. What distinguished Antiochus from previous rulers was that he was what you might call a Greek fundamentalist. He insisted that all his subjects had to be converted to the Greek way of life and religion. And he made some progress, including among the Jewish community. Later, however, Antiochus takes up a more antagonistic relationship with the Jews. He makes a point of entering the temple in person and profaning its holy vessels. Shortly thereafter, he takes advantage of the Sabbath to commit a massacre. In this and many other ways, Antiochus establishes himself as a self-conscious enemy, not simply of the Jews, but of their religion, and therefore of their God. These events utterly shatter the prophetic paradigm of the relationship between God and the earthly rulers. It was a state of exception, just to tie it in more explicitly with the theme. And it caused a lot of more radical solutions. At this point, the faithful remnant of the Jewish community takes two paths. First, Judas Maccabeus escapes with some comrades into the wilderness where they're going to come back and purify the promised land as their ancestors never did. He wants to go back to Deuteronomy. He wants to just reboot. Those who remain in the city often submit to martyrdom. And the book of 2nd Maccabees is kind of the first account of martyrdom as a political strategy. The most famous account is in 2nd Maccabees 7, where a mother is made to witness the torture and death of 7 of her sons before being killed herself. She is uncompromisingly defiant throughout the entire proceedings. She and her sons sometimes make reference to the notion that they're being punished for Israel's unfaithfulness, but you can kind of tell they don't really mean it. Their real source of confidence is their unwavering conviction that God will ultimately raise them all from the dead. God will fix this in a radical way. The promise of the prophetic paradigm that one's ancestors will eventually return to the promised land, that's no longer operative. Not only are they in the promised land already, but their family line is being radically wiped out. Yet just as their Deuteronomistic and prophetic forebears had done before them, they respond to an event that could discredit God by doubling down. If the Maccabees respond to the breakdown of the prophetic paradigm by forcing a reboot of the Deuteronomistic covenant, these martyrs are effectively demanding that God reboot creation itself, that he recreate them along with the world they live in. Indeed, they claim the world was always intended to arrive at such an unbearable state as part of God's long-standing plan to remake it. In other words, if the world no longer makes sense in light of the apocalyptic thinker's faith in a just and powerful God, so much the worse for the world. Within this scheme, I think we can say with confidence, Antiochus is the model for the devil. He shares with the devil a conscious rebellion against God, motivated by a mixture of wounded pride and just sheer spite. This leads him to persecute God's faithful remnant with such ferocity that they can only make sense of their world by developing a complex spiritual overlay for political events. And this apocalyptic vision transforms the vagaries of geopolitics into a cosmic drama, culminating in a final confrontation between the head of God's heavenly host and God's greatest political theological rival, history's greatest monster, Antiochus Epiphanes. Somebody that most of you, I assume, have never heard of. Now, I think that we can see that there are pragmatic benefits to speaking in code when you're talking about controversial ongoing political events, but I think it's a mistake to think that the apocalyptic documents are coded in any kind of reductive sense. It is not the case that the theological symbolism really refers to actual political events, because in the Hebrew biblical tradition, the political is always immediately theological. And this is above all the case with Antiochus' persecution. This is a contingent historical event. It didn't need to happen. Antiochus reigned for only 10 years. There were no kings before or after him who pursued a similar policy. But this forced a complete change in Jewish thought that had, enduring effects even up to today. And in the centuries that followed, this event had such impact that Jewish and Christian thinkers would reread and in some cases rewrite the Hebrew biblical tradition as though it had always been apocalyptic in intent. The prophetic writers would be transformed from theological political commentators into visionaries who are giving us hints of God's mysterious plan. Even the early patriarchs would be pressed into service as apocalyptic teachers. This is above all the case with the mysterious figure Enoch, who was taken up into heaven, who we learn centuries and centuries later had a very ambitious literary career. But the fact that he lived 365 years did allow the time. I don't think it's implausible. It would come to seem, basically, that there had always been an apparatus of angels and demons governing the world, that God always had a plan culminating in the resurrection of the dead and the last judgment, and that God had always had an arch-rival plotting against humanity, even in the Garden of Eden itself. Yet it was not always so. All of these theological developments had a concrete political origin that can be pinpointed with uncanny precision. The apocalyptic worldview came into being on the day that Antiochus Epiphanes desecrated the temple. On that day, we can say with only a slight exaggeration, the devil was born. Now, the Hebrew Bible's attempts to come to grips with the problem of evil were enough to create the devil, but they were not enough to make him a site of much creative theological reflection. That task was left to the Christian tradition. And immediately it's clear that much more is at stake. The devil is no longer some two-bit forgotten king, Antiochus Epiphanes. They have bigger fish to fry. The Roman Empire, which ordered the execution of Jesus and the persecution of his followers, that's the devil. Yet their gesture is fundamentally the same as their Jewish forebears. Rather than admitting that their Messiah had been defeated, they maintained that his shameful execution and death were actually precisely the greatest proof that he was the true Messiah. Indeed, they ultimately took the step of exalting their Messiah to a much higher level than any previous messianic figures. He wasn't simply God's special servant. He was in some sense God himself. Yet again, we have a repetition of the basic gesture of doubling down, but a mutation occurs. Because within the Jewish apocalyptic paradigm, there was always the chance that you were wrong. It wasn't actually the end times. Okay, we can go back to the regular state, the prophetic paradigm. We got excited, we got carried away, okay, back to normal. In Christianity, though, there's no going back. There is no more normal. Because Christ's incarnation, death, and resurrection have set the end times in motion. To go back would mean to just not be a Christian anymore. The apocalyptic sequence has already started, and the end can only be deferred, as it has been, apparently indefinitely. Living in this strange intermediate state where the end has already begun, but it hasn't finished, this produces strange and paradoxical effects in the specifically Christian form of apocalypticism. And I intend, as I've noted before, and again, hold me accountable, I intend to write an entire book documenting these strange effects. But for today, however, perhaps it is enough to show where the devil came from. He did not originate from a literary figure like the serpent or Job's accuser, nor was it from some kind of conceptual reflection on the nature of evil. The devil came out of a specific historical experience that decisively changed the self-understanding of the Jewish people. In short, Tertullian is right. We can reflect our way to God, but for the devil, we need a historical revelation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and we have time for questions now from the audience. Go ahead.
First, I wanted to give a shout out for Professor Robert Stock. I don't know if you've read any of his work, but he's an emeritus professor here. He did extensive research on the demonic, the role of the demonic in restoration literature. So you might want to look at one of our own in your future research. My question has to do with gender in the role of the demon, the demonic, the devil, Satan in political theology, because it seems as though, save for the mother with her 7 children, this is a very masculine story. And so I wonder what the role of the woman Catholic theology has the woman being the arch nemesis of Satan. I wonder what political theologians, if that's a term today, would make for the role of women in this unfolding drama with the demonic.
Yeah, you're right. It is a very masculine narrative, and the role of women, aside from the story of Eve, obviously, where it really comes to a head is in actually like late medieval, early modern kind of transitional period, where there was a seriously a 2-century long persecution of witches, and it turns out that women are in league with the devil, that they're selling their souls to the devil in like horrifying numbers, all in order to persecute men. There's a great deal of anxiety about whether it's accepted that witches appear to make men's sexual member disappear, but the theological question is this really happening, or is it just an illusion? And I think that the fact that women don't seem to fit into the narrative is precisely the reason that it gets attached to the devil. Because over the course of Christian history, the devil gets attached to basically everything that doesn't fit. Women are a permanent fixture of human society, obviously, and yet men are regarded as the normative and more ideal human. What do we do with women? It's always a question. And these Christian thinkers thought, well, let's throw them into the demonic grab bag. It's a similar fate with Jews. Christians seem to assume that if the Jews just sat down and read the Bible, they would see that Jesus was like totally predicted the whole time. And some of them even say that the Jews, in their heart of hearts, they really do know that Jesus is the Messiah. But they persist in not converting, basically out of sheer stubbornness. And this leads them to be associated with the devil because it seems to be like willful evil. Just like women who don't submit to their husbands, who seek abortion or birth control, and the primitive methods they had back then are suspected of being in line with the devil. Does this answer your question?
What do we do with the figure of Mary?
Yeah, elaborate precautions have to be taken for her to play her role. She even gets a special exemption from original sin. Her parents, the only couple in human history ever to have sex in such a way as not to pass on original sin, so that Jesus can be born through this perfect vessel. It's a case of like holding up an exceptional woman so that regular women can be denigrated all the more.
Thank you.
You mentioned God through a mediator, telling the Hebrew people who were asking for a king, but the king they were asking for would seize 1/10 of what they owned and use it for his own ambitions. Chronologically, when is a tithe also a tenth of belongings required of the Israelites by God, and what, if any, significance does this ironic event hold?
I hadn't noticed that connection, but that's a good connection. That yeah, the 10% figure, that's also what should be given to God in many cases. So that just highlights the rivalry. I shall add that to the next version.
I know you said today you were going to talk mainly about the devil as it comes out of the Jewish tradition and the Christian tradition, but you alluded to working on other traditions. And can you say a little, in the larger piece, can you say a little bit about where that work is going, particularly with Islam and maybe, I don't know, you're doing Zoroastrianism? I don't know what you're doing.
Yeah. The main line of my argument would go from Judaism to Christianity to modernity. But I've been doing a lot of teaching over Islam, and I want to find some way to integrate it because I think it's a really interesting perspective. Basically, at least in the Quran itself, I find their approach to the problem of evil to be kind of refreshing because there's just not anxiety about it somehow. It's like, yeah, God causes everything, including evil, like, live with it. And there's the story of the devil in the Quran is repeated several times with slight deviations. I'm just going to tell it to you because it's interesting. So God creates the first human being, and he gives this human being knowledge of the names of all things, the proper names of everything in creation. This is kind of, it seems to be kind of in complex dialogue with the story where Adam names all the animals from Genesis. So after he creates the human being, he says to the angels, do you guys happen to know the names of all the things? And they're like, no, how would we know that? He says, well, check this out. Adam, he knows all the names, and then Adam dutifully recites it. And then God says, well, in honor of this great achievement, you should bow down in homage to the human being. And the devil, who in this story is called Iblis, refuses to do so. Basically because he's a snob. He says that the human is made out of clay, I'm made out of fire. You expect me to bow down to that inferior being? And this theme of angelic snobbery actually it continues throughout the tradition. For Milton, all the angels are kind of snobs. You should watch for it next time you read Paradise Lost. God takes Iblis aside, says, we can't have this. I'm going to exile you, send you to hell. Iblis says, can you just please give me respite until the last day? And God says, yes, I can do that. He says, okay, and just so you know, I am going to try to induce every human being I come across to betray you and to join my side instead. And God says, okay, let's do that. It's really amazing. It's kind of, it reminds me of the situation in Job where the accuser confronts God and says, well, you know, if you weren't so generous to Job, he would follow you. And then God gives him permission to tempt him and test him in various ways. But in this case, it's like we're all Job. And that scenario, to me, is terrifying. But the fact that it seems to like be presented with such confidence that it's not going to be terrifying, it's really, really interesting and it's something that I want to pursue. I'm not sure